Welcome back to my inner sanctum. I am your hostess, Countess Elizabeth, mistress of the macabre. Humans have trivial things such as birthdays, and even creatures of the night often celebrate a birthday or two. Today happens to be the day that I was spawned from the earth, and because of this we will investigate a plane crash that I am obsessed with that changed music history. The day the music died, and the events that led up to the deaths of singers Ritchie Valens, Buddy Holly, and the Big Bopper J.P. Richardson. So let us strap ourselves into that Beechcraft bonanza and set out on that snowy evening as we explore our grotesque curiosity. First, let's get some background on the singers and the events leading up to the plane crash that took the lives of such young talent. Ritchie Valens, originally Ritchie Valenzuela, was a rising Chicano star during the time period and was sort of the first Hispanic rock and roll star, even though his career was cut so short. He had just started his recording career and was on his first big tour, being only 8 months into his first signed contract with Bob Keane of Delphi Records on that fateful day. Also noteworthy is that Ritchie had a fear of flying, as highlighted in the movie La Bamba. Buddy Holly was a much bigger name on the Winter Dance Party tour, as he was one of the members of the Crickets, a band he had just left. He wanted to go back on tour because he wanted to start a life with his pregnant wife back in New York City. He had just gotten married. So in order to do that, and for a few other reasons that go down to Holly's dealing with his manager stealing his money, he decided to go on tour. Holly assembled a band consisting of other now famous musicians such as Waylon Jennings on bass, Tommy Allsup on guitar, and Carl Bunch on drums. Giles J.P. Richardson Jr. was the third singer who died that fateful day, known as the Big Bopper. He was a fellow musician in his own right, but not quite as big as Buddy Holly. His best-known compositions are Chantilly Lace and White Lightning. The tour was set to cover 24 Midwestern cities, and it was a very long tour, as there were no off days. They did the tour by bus, but the buses were not well equipped to handle the Midwestern winter weather. The 1959 tour began in Milwaukee, Wisconsin on January 23rd. The performance at Clear Lake on February 2nd was the 11th of 24 scheduled locations. The amount of travel required soon became a serious problem. The distances between the venues had not been properly considered when the performances were scheduled. Instead of systematically circling around the Midwest through a series of venues in close proximity to one another, the tour erratically meandered back and forth across the region, with distances between some tour stops exceeding 400 miles. As there were no off days, the band had to travel most of the day, frequently for 10 to 12 hours in freezing temperatures. They had to unload their own equipment, there were no roadies or assistants, play the show, reload the equipment, and travel on again. At this time, most of the interstate highway system had not been built, so the routes between tour stops required far more driving time on narrow 2-lane rural highways than they would on later expressways. General Artists Corporation, the organization that booked the tour, later received considerable criticism for their seemingly total disregard for the conditions that they forced the touring musicians to endure, with one Buddy Holly historian calling it the tour from hell. The entire company of musicians traveled together in one bus, although the buses used for the tour were wholly inadequate, breaking down and being replaced frequently. Buddy Holly historian Bill Griggs estimates that 5 separate buses were used the first 11 days of the tour, reconditioned school buses, not good enough for school kids. The artists themselves were responsible for loading and unloading equipment at each stop, as no road crew assisted them. Adding to the disarray, the buses were not equipped for the harsh weather, which consisted of waist-deep snow in several areas and varying temperatures from 20 degrees Fahrenheit, -7 degrees Celsius, to as low as -36 degrees Fahrenheit or -38 Celsius. One bus had a heating system malfunction shortly after the tour began in Appleton, Wisconsin. Later, the Big Bopper and Ritchie Valens began experiencing flu-like symptoms, and drummer Brunch was hospitalized for frostbitten feet after the tour bus broke down in the middle of the highway in sub-zero temperatures near Ironwood, Michigan. The musicians replaced that bus with another school bus and kept traveling. This must have seemed like hell for Ritchie Valens, who, I may remind you, was on his first tour out of state with Buddy Holly and the crew. He was also from California, so it's relatively warm there compared to Michigan. On Monday, February 2nd, the tour arrived in Clear Lake, west of Mason City, having driven 350 miles, 560 kilometers, from the previous day's concert in Green Bay. The town in northern Iowa had not been a scheduled stop. Tour promoters hoped to fill the open date and called the manager of the local surf ballroom, Carol Anderson, and offered Holly the show, but Holly accepted, and they set the show for that night. By the time Holly arrived in the venue that evening, he was frustrated with the ongoing problems with the bus, so Holly chartered a plane to fly himself and his band to Fargo, North Dakota, which is adjacent to Moorhead, North Dakota, which would be the next stop on their tour. It is rumored that Holly wanted to get the plane chartered so that he could do some of his laundry and not be on the freezing bus in dirty clothes. The rest of the party would have picked him up in Moorhead, saving him the journey on the bus and leaving him time to get some rest. They were going to Moorhead for a radio performance at the station KFGO with disc jockey Charlie Boone, a meeting Holly, Valens, and the Big Bopper would never make. Flight arrangements were made with Roger Peterson, a 21-year-old pilot described as a young married man who built his life around flying. The flying service charged a fee of $36 per passenger for the flight on the 1947 single-engined V-tailed Beechcraft 35 Bonanza, which seated 3 passengers plus the pilot. The most widely accepted version of events was that the Big Bopper had contracted flu during the tour and asked Jennings for his seat on the plane. When Holly learned that Jennings was not going to fly, Holly said to Jennings in jest, "Well, I hope your old bus freezes up." And Jennings responded, "Well, I hope your old plane crashes." A humorous but ill-fated response that haunted Jennings for the rest of his life. Valens, who had a fear of flying, asked Alsop for his seat on the plane. The two agreed to a coin toss to decide. Bob Hale, a disc jockey at the Mason City KRIB AM, was at the concert that night and flipped the coin in the ballroom side stage shortly before the musicians departed for the airport. Valens won the coin toss for the seat on the flight, the last coin toss he would ever win. After the show ended, Holly, Valens, and the Big Bopper were driven to nearby Mason City Municipal Airport to meet with Destiny. The weather at the time of departure was reported as light snow, a ceiling of 3,000 feet, 900 meters, with sky obscured, visibility 6 miles or 10 kilometers, and winds ranging from 20 to 30 miles per hour, or 32 to 48 kilometers per hour. Although the deteriorating weather was reported along the planned route, the weather briefings the pilot received failed to relay the information. On Tuesday, February 3rd, 1959, at 12:55 a.m. Central Standard Time, the plane took off normally from runway 17. It was witnessed taking off southbound from a platform outside the control tower. After an additional left turn to a northwesterly heading, the tail light was then observed, gradually descending until it disappeared. However, at around 1 a.m., when the pilot, Peterson, failed to make an expected radio contact with Supervisor Hubert Jerry Dwyer of the Dwyer Flying Service in Mason City, repeated attempts to establish communications were made, at Dwyer's request, by the radio operator, but they were all unsuccessful. Later that morning, Dwyer, having heard no word from Peterson since his departure, took off in another airplane to retrace Peterson's planned route. Within minutes, at around 9:35 a.m., he spotted the wreckage less than 6 miles or 10 kilometers northwest of the airport. The Beechcraft Bonanza had impacted terrain at high speed, estimated to have been around 170 miles per hour, 270 kilometers per hour. The right wing tip had stuck in the ground first, sending the aircraft cartwheeling across the frozen field for 540 feet, 160 meters. Before coming to a rest against a wire fence at the edge of a field. The bodies of Holly and Valens had been ejected from the fuselage and lay near the plane's wreckage. The Big Bopper's body had been thrown over the fence and into a cornfield where Peterson's body was entangled in the wreckage. Everyone died instantly. The bodies were later identified by Carol Anderson, the promoter of the Surf Ballroom, because the other band members were already en route to Fargo, North Dakota. The official investigation was carried out by Civil Aeronautics Board. It emerged that Peterson had over 4 years of flying experience, of which was with Dwyer's flying service, and had accumulated 711 flying hours, of which 128 were on Beechcraft Bonanzas. He had also logged 52 hours of instrument flight training, although he had passed only his written examination and was not yet qualified to operate in weather that required flying solely by reference of instruments. In other words, he was only mildly qualified to fly in such weather. He and Dwyer Flying Service itself were certified to operate only under visual flight rules, which essentially require that the pilot must be able to see where he's going. However, on the night of the accident, visual flight would have been virtually impossible due to the low clouds and lack of visible horizon, and the absence of ground lights over the sparsely populated area. The official investigation ended ultimately with the conclusion that it was an inexperienced pilot error that led to the crash that fateful day. Well, that was truly a grotesque tale. The day the music died, as some people called it. This case has always been fascinating to me, not just because the big names that died tragically that day, but how something so simple as a coin toss ultimately decided the fate of Ritchie Valens. I feel so bad for Ritchie because he was on his first big tour. It was hell, then it all came literally crashing down. Also, I can't blame Buddy Holly for not wanting to be on a freezing bus in dirty clothes. But at the same time, was it really worth the gamble with your life? Although I suppose he didn't know that the pilot didn't have the right experience. May their souls rest in peace. Thank you for watching the video. Subscribe, like, and share if you would also like to keep exploring our grotesque curiosity. We will meet again in the darkness of the night.